She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and she's the author of a series of award-winning books, including In Her Nature, How Women Break Boundaries in the Great Outdoors, A Revolution of Feeling, The Decade That Forged the Modern Mind, and Map of a Nation, a biography of the Ordnance Survey. And today, Rachel will be talking to us about her book, In Her Nature, and her work around that. And her title, very appropriately for the Centre for Technology in the Body, is She's a Machine, Women and Outdoor Sport. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. I should say that what I'm going to talk about isn't directly in my book, In Her Nature, but I was really pleased to be asked to give this talk, which made me sort of think quite differently about some of the themes that are in that book. So this kind of uses some of the things in the book, but it's kind of new material, I suppose, that I've been prompted to think about since Jasmine Paris finished the Barkley Marathons and some of the press coverage around her. I should say that I am going to talk about female ultra-runners, but it's not necessary to know or really even to care about ultra-running or endurance sport for this talk. Because I'm really, I think, using this idea, this repeated phrase, she's a machine, which crops up in a lot of sort of phrase of female runners. I'm using it as a way into looking at certain cultural attitudes towards the female body in general. So I'm sort of really questioning, what does it mean when we want female bodies to be like machines, or when we kind of approvingly apply these kind of mechanistic metaphors to the female body. So this is Jasmine Paris. Jasmine Paris is a British fell runner and ultra runner, so that means she runs races that are mainly off-road and lengthy distances. So an ultra marathon is anything that's longer than a marathon, but she does races that are sort of 300 miles or whatever. She's been kind of well known in the British fell running and trail and ultra running communities for a while, but she first became sort of better known outside of those circles in 2019 when she won a race called the Spine Race, which is a race up the Pennine Way. It's 268 miles from Edale in Derbyshire to Kirk Yetholm. And the Spine Race takes place in early January, so 2/3 of the race is run in complete darkness. Jasmine Paris won the race in 2019. She won it outright, so she beat all the men and all the women, and she smashed the previous course record by over 12 hours. And, the press coverage around Jasmine Paris for that race was kind of particularly impressed, and rightly so, that she did all this whilst also working full-time as a vet, studying for a PhD, and also just a few months really after giving birth. So she was expressing milk at checkpoints throughout the race. Recently, like in the last sort of few weeks, she's been particularly sort of prominent in the sporting press because she's become the first woman ever to finish a race that's called the Barkley Marathons. So for anyone who doesn't know what the Barkley Marathons are, it's a race that was devised in Tennessee in 1986, and it takes place in the Frozen Head State Park and in the territory around the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. And the idea for the race came to its organisers when they were sort of reading an anecdote about a former inmate at the prison who managed to escape. But because of the difficulty of the terrain, this inmate was on the run for 60 hours, but managed to make it only 12 miles from the prison. So the organisers thought, this would be a great place for a trail run. The Barkley Marathons consists of 5 loops. Each loop is around 20 to sort of 28 miles. So the final race, the full distance that a runner would complete, if they complete it, is about 100 to 120 miles. Since it's been sort of taking place in that format, only 20 people have ever finished the race. And until a few weeks ago, no women had ever finished the race. And in fact, one of the organisers, who is a man called Gary Cantrell, but better known as Lazarus Lake, he said a few years ago that he thought that, in his words, the race is too hard for women. They're simply not tough enough to do it. But Jasmine Paris has sort of been on the start line for a few years. This year she did manage to finish it, and she finished it with 99 seconds before the cut-off. And this is her on the finishing gate. The sort of praise that's been lavished on Jasmine Paris since this kind of incredible sporting achievement has particularly used this phrase, "she's like a machine." These are some of the quotes from press coverage. Jasmine Paris is a machine. She's an absolute machine. She's very focused, driven, machine-like. She's an absolute superhuman. She's unreal. And this is one of my favourite quotes, really. Jasmine Paris is a machine. She never got upset, and she was swan-like all the way to the end. And that's actually about her smashing of the course record on the spine race rather than the Barclay Marathons, but it uses that same language. Now, it is important to say that that language, that metaphor of being like a machine, is applied to some male ultra runners too. The mountain runner Kilian Jornet is frequently referred to as a machine. But I do think that this language is doing something a little bit different when it's applied to a woman. And I think that's particularly revealed in this description of her being like a machine because she never got upset and was swan-like all the way to the end. And, that's a quote from one of the race directors of the spine race, a man called Scott Gilmore. I can't think of any male runner who's ever been described and praised for being swan-like. Firstly, I want to say that I think this description, this praise that's heaped on successful ultra runners for being like machines, reveals a sort of misunderstanding of what's actually involved in ultra running. I think that, the machine metaphor implies that the runner in question is largely unfeeling, that they're sort of comprised of a sort of pure physical motion. And that their bodies are like a machine that's set in motion by a largely emotionless brain, which is, I think, this is a kind of illustration of that, really. We've got a sort of head in which the kind of hair resembles a brain, and then everything else is a sort of unfeeling set of kind of mechanistic muscles. But in my experience, and in descriptions of running and endurance sport by other athletes, ultra running isn't at all about obliterating emotion. For me, ultra running is not about transcending emotion, but it's about knowing your emotions. It's about knowing what triggers certain emotions. It's about knowing how your emotions relate to particular physical states, such as hunger or tiredness. To do a race well, you kind of have to know how to trigger certain useful emotions in your experience, such as excitement or joy or even love. And you have to know how to manage more difficult emotions, such as fear and anger. Emotions are actually really useful in ultra running. I tend not to sort of feel hungry and thirsty when I'm running in the same way that I do when I'm not running. But instead, what kind of indicates that I'm hungry or thirsty is that I start getting really grumpy. So it's like you have to sort of be able to read these emotional cues, these emotional tells, which actually kind of give you information about your body in the race. Similarly, I think, fear is a really useful emotion when you're doing endurance sport. You need to know that you're on the sort of boundaries of something that's safe. You need to know whether that fear is telling you something about your environment or telling you something about kind of your body being at its limits. And I also think that, you know, positive emotions such as ecstasy and pleasure and joy, you know, these feelings where you get this kind of incredible sort of explosion or sort of tingling sensation for me, kind of, you know, down my neck and arms, you know, that's the reason why you do it. You know, so emotions, you know, they're useful communicators, but they're really useful kind of drivers for sport as well. And, you know, I don't think that I'm alone in this. I've done quite for In Her Nature, I did quite a lot of reading of accounts of outdoor sport by female athletes and adventurers, you know, from the sort of 18th century to the present day. And, you know, a number of them saw the kind of emotions that are provoked by sport and adventure, you know, absolutely as the reason for doing it. This is Lady Florence Dixie, and she published a book in 1880 called Across Patagonia, which described, among other things, some of her mountaineering experiences in South America. And, you know, the reason that she really relished that kind of endurance sport was because it sort of, you know, she felt like it gave her this experience of a wider range of intense emotions than she would get in her normal day-to-day life back in Britain. A longing grows up within one to taste a more vigorous emotion than that afforded by the monotonous round of society's so-called pleasures. You know, she describes elsewhere in that book how the trip was prompted because she was, in her words, hunting for a new emotion. And she repeatedly describes the pleasure of, in her words, giving myself up to the influence of the emotions which the scenery awaits in me. So I think that, you know, the idea that successful ultra running is like being an emotionless machine is wrong. And I also think the description of Jasmine Paris as an emotionless machine is also not commensurate with reality. She really, you know, if you actually listen to her in interviews, she doesn't come across as an emotionless person at all. You know, she describes how ultra running is exciting, a thrill. And she was describing her final kilometre at the Barclay Marathons, where she realised that it was going to be right down to the wire, and the final kilometre's all uphill. She'd been running solidly for just under 60 hours, you know, and the photograph of her on the finish line, you know, she's so pale, and she just describes making a decision that, you know, she was going to run until she passed out, basically. But in interviews immediately afterwards, she describes that final kilometre as, you know, being a bit traumatic. She talks about how a hot internal fire is her primary driver to do these kind of events. The Barclays was the hardest thing I've ever done, the hardest I've ever pushed myself. She talks about, you know, her own sort of techniques of emotional management. You know that you're going to feel sick. You know that you're going to spend time thinking, why am I doing this? You know that you're going to feel lonely, but you just have to get through it. She talks about being in a bit of a state. And, you know, the sort of positives, it was an immense feeling and really intense. You know, so I don't think this portrays an image of Jasmine Paris as someone who is like this emotionless machine. So instead, what I kind of want to talk about is not taking this phrase at face value, you know, not as a kind of realistic descriptor either of Jasmine Paris or of the qualities that ultra running requires. But I'm going to talk about the assumptions that I think are contained in this idea that she's a machine. And, you know, how that phrase is revealing about certain attitudes to women in sport. So, you know, what are we really saying, or what are journalists really saying when they describe Jasmine Paris as a machine? You know, I've talked a lot about how I think sort of machines connote emotionless and emotionlessness. And I think that, you know, the sort of approving use of the word emotion draws upon this kind of historical Christian idea that, you know, if we have souls, that they're arranged in this kind of hierarchical form, in which at the top of the hierarchy, the most praised qualities are things like kind of reason and control, and at the kind of bottom of the hierarchical soul are things like sort of instinct and emotion that are seen as kind of responsible for some form of kind of physical and social chaos. This idea of, the kind of hierarchical soul, the sort of emotions at the top of the hierarchy, those sort of faculties of kind of reason and kind of consciousness and things to do with order, they're obviously also associated with masculinity historically. So I think that there's an idea that if someone's being praised for being, constituted more of mind and less of body, more about control and less about emotion and chaos, they are also being praised for being kind of more like a man. I've sort of taken at random, really, a lot of front covers of running books from Amazon, because I think, there's this this kind of image of the human form, when ultra running kind of crops up again and again, and I think it shows the sort of human body as this sort of honed, masculine physique. These bodies don't have any fat on them. They're bodies that are about sort of, they have this kind of like pleasing geometry, quite a lot of kind of 90-degree angles. It's really a kind of controlled motion. It's also sort of nothing like ultra runners look in the last sort of 10 miles of a 300-mile race, But I think, this is about, these images are, developing this idea of runners being like machines, of being controlled and mechanistic, of being sort of mathematical and rational and orderly. And, the fact that, so I think that, in a way they're sort of similar to this, to sort of Leonardo da Vinci's sort of idea of this kind of geometric human body. And, the fact that kind of these bodies don't accommodate something that's kind of, stereotypically associated with less control, right? It's like the point of ultra running for a lot of these books is to attain this kind of toned physique, despite the fact that actually a bit of fat is quite useful for really, really long distance running. I have friends who do the really long stuff, like 300, 500 miles, and they all put on weight deliberately beforehand, because you just can't take on that many calories during a race of that length. You have to have some stored to begin with. So this is all sort of kind of rhetorical and ideological, I think, rather than being a kind of true representation of what ultra running is about. When women do appear on some of the covers, it's often like they've actually just taken the male image and put a ponytail on it, or sort of turned it pink, or put a flower next to it. There's often not anything that really portrays these bodies as actually being female bodies. And I think, I've never seen really one of these sort of running cartoons of a woman who has like really obvious breasts, or is pregnant, or has more body fat and wider hips. They're replicating this sort of male-like mechanistic physique. So I think that, when female runners are shown like this and referred to approvingly as machines, what's being said is that, they're good because they're like ideas that are associated with men and masculinity. Or I think, there's a suggestion that there is such a thing as a unisex runner. I did contact one of the authors of one of these books and said, it's a shame that, that there's no images of women. He said, oh, no, it's this one here, the footnotes. Yeah, he said, no, that's a unisex runner. And it sort of reminds me a bit of, when you finish a race, you often get given a t-shirt, and, I can count on the fingers of one hand the times that I've been given the option of a t-shirt with a female fit. So instead the t-shirts are cut to a male body, and too tight around my breasts, too tight around my hips, gaping around the stomach. But I've been told, no, they're unisex t-shirts. There isn't such a thing as a kind of, unisex body in sport. It's like, it's just a sort of shorthand for the invisibility of the female body, really. So I think that, you know, when we call female runners machines and show them approvingly in this kind of geometric and quasi-masculine form, women are being praised insofar as they and their bodies don't challenge or subvert ideas that prowess in sport is fundamentally about discipline and male power and ideas of rationality and control that are historically associated with men. As a sort of slight sort of sideline to this, this is a quote I came across on Reddit, which claims that the people who do best at ultramarathons like Barkley are in STEM subjects, and that the reason that women are getting better at ultra running is that there are more women in STEM subjects. You know, so I think this is a kind of offshoot of the same idea, and the same kind of misconception, really, that, you know, running is all about kind of calculation and rationality and control. It's not about, you know, creativity or instinct or emotion or any of those things that are stereotypically associated with women. And so again, it's sort of like, well, women, you know, this is the claim that, well, women are getting good the more like ideas associated with men they become. And, oh, sorry, I was going to sort of just say, you know, this isn't a new thing. You know, it crops up again and again and again in 19th century writings by female athletes that, you know, they're very open about considering sport a manly pursuit, and they consider other women good insofar as they are like men. You know, that actually a lot of these women want to distance themselves from other women who they see as sort of potentially endangering what sport is all about. Now, I want to return to this idea of Jasmine Paris being like a machine because she never got upset and was swan-like all the way to the end. So I think, you know, firstly, what this quote makes me think is that, you know, the race director was clearly really worried that she was going to get upset. You know, this was clearly something that was causing him stress. And I was sort of wondering, well, you know, what's wrong about getting upset? Like, why on earth would a race director care if Jasmine Paris was having a little cry to herself on, like, you know, the middle of the Cheviots at sort of 3 in the morning? And so I sort of wonder if actually, when he's saying that he's relieved that she didn't get upset, what he's really doing is expressing his relief that she didn't require some form of support. You know, there's no reason for him to care if she got upset. What he's saying is, like, she didn't get upset, and she didn't need anything from me. And this really reminded me of a book that was published in 1859 by a female mountaineer called Eliza Cole, called A Lady's Tour Around Monte Rosa. And she describes how her male mountain guide was really worried about, you know, climbing with a woman. And, you know, he said to her that he was worried she was, you know, going to get upset, and that she wouldn't be physically or emotionally capable, and that therefore she would become, in his words, an encumbrance. And I sort of wonder if that's what's going on here. You know, that he's worried that Jasmine Paris will get upset and become an encumbrance. So I wonder if that machine metaphor, that sort of form of the idea that sort of being compared to a machine as a form of praise, is about women being praised insofar as they don't expect any help from men, and they don't expect men's sport and men's sporting pursuits to kind of be paused while they encumber them. I think, you know, possibly it's about sort of women being praised for being unusually self-sufficient. And, you know, I think there's a kind of idea that ultra running, you know, absolutely relies upon self-sufficiency, and certainly to an extent that's true. But I also think that, you know, by saying that, you know, ultra running is about self-sufficiency, what's also going on is a kind of rendering invisible of the support work that women do to enable male ultra runners. You know, so I think sort of there's a lot of support that goes on around ultra running. So, you know, some of like my own sort of, you know, in my experience, when I've done sort of long distance races, you know, you're allowed a support crew for a lot of them who can come along and meet you at various points along the route and give you like a change of clothes or some food or drink, or, you know, allow you to have a sleep in a kind of camper van or whatever. And, you know, overwhelmingly, it's women who constitute those support crews, you know, it's wives or mothers. I have a friend who is a very talented female ultra runner, and her husband is also an ultra runner, and she packs his bags for him. You know, she packs his drop bag, which is taken at various points on the route, and she writes him up a race strategy, you know, at 20 miles eat this, 30 miles eat this. You know, there's, I'm on, you know, a number of online communities that exist to discuss various aspects of races, and there's constantly kind of women joining those groups, not because they run, but because they are supporting their husbands who run, and they want, you know, they want to research the kind of best way to do this. So I sort of think, you know, there's this real gendered division going on in who's expected to provide the support and who's expected to be the apparently self-sufficient runner. And, you know, it just isn't expected in the same way that men form support crews for women. I was sort of spending the train journey up here, going back over sort of an online chat that I had with a number of female ultra runners like quite a while ago, because I sort of remember having a kind of conversation about this. And so these are some of the quotes from various women about, you know, whether it's reasonable that there is this kind of gender division of care work in ultra running. So I do not expect anything from my husband. My husband rarely shows up. I can probably count on one hand how many times he's supported me in my endeavours, although I have walked a lot of golf courses with him. I've even finished a few races in tears because no one was there to cheer me through the finish. It can be so potentially powerful for kids and family to see you when you're not being their support. But over the years, I've learned to just do my own thing and not get upset about uninvolved families. So there's that phrase again, I didn't get upset, I didn't require anything, I didn't require any support. We often think men understand the relatively normal stuff like us wanting support, but they don't. I divorced my husband after he sat in the hotel room watching TV while I finished my first Ironman. I've learned to get reinforcement, encouragement and support from others because my husband has no interest in my running. My husband is not a race support character or the supporter or nurturer in our relationship. Which is pretty depressing. So I think, you know, all of this is part of a much wider cultural pattern in which, you know, women's cultural role is seen as supporting men, both practically and through praise, and that, you know, gendered roles in sport are kind of a microcosm of that. And I think it's worth sort of bringing up that a phrase by a man called Pierre de Coubertin, who was the founder of the modern Olympic Games, who really didn't see women having an active role in competitive sport at all. And when pressed on it, said, well, you know, sport's not in women's nature, and that women's only possible role in sport was, in quotes, the crowning of the male victors with laurels. So I think that, you know, this, what's contained in that phrase, she's a machine, she doesn't get upset, is also women being praised for not requiring anything of men, for not subverting the sort of gendered stereotype whereby women support male ultra-runners and not the other way around. I also wonder if there's an element of women being praised for not complaining. What Scott Gilmore, the spine race director, was talking about is Jasmine Paris not getting upset, you know, because it was a long race and she was tired and hungry. But actually, you know, there is an element in which I think sort of women are accepted in the ultra-running world slightly under sufferance, and that when they start complaining about ways in which that kind of sporting culture is organised, they're really subjected to, you know, pretty horrific abuse. You know, there is a lot that women have to complain about in kind of sporting systems and structures. Just in, you know, in running, there's hugely unequal prize money and sponsorship. 71% of sponsored female athletes in the US earn less than $10,000 per year, compared to only 29% of men. It's grossly unequal media coverage, kind of across sport in general. 5% of US media coverage of sport covers women's sport. Race cut-offs tend to be designed around average male speeds, meaning that women have to work 15% harder to meet them. There's an almost kind of total invisibility of women in sports science research. In 2019, only 6% of sports science research was dedicated to female bodies. There's an enormous and widening leisure gap between men and women, in which men in the UK enjoy over 5 hours per week more leisure time than women. And that's obviously time that men have to train, but also to rest and recover. And there's an escalation of violence against women by men, both in secure sports facilities such as football stadiums, so violence by male spectators towards female spectators of football matches has trebled in the last 7 years. But also in public spaces such as streets and parks where women train. And, you know, a particularly shocking statistic, I think, is that more women have been murdered by men while out running in the last 8 years than in the 30 years before that. But, you know, when women do complain, when they do get upset, when they are not like machines, they are often met with, you know, total sort of vilification, really. And just one example to this, one example of this is Lazarus Lake. This is Lazarus Lake, who is the one of the founders of the Barkley Marathons, and, you know, a few years ago he said, you know, the race is too hard for women, they're simply not tough enough to do it. A number of women have complained about this, both at the time and more recently on social media, and have been told, these are just a few quotes I picked up off Facebook a couple of hours ago, been told you're fear-mongering, you're whining, you're whinging, no one should be offended by his comment, you're so uneducated, you're talking bollocks. And this is men's justifications, you know, of kind of Lazarus's sexism. I bet he's proud to be proven wrong. You can tell he's really hoping that one day a lady will finish. I love this, it's 100% vintage Laz. He provokes challenges in the hopes they'll be met. He says stuff like this to goad people into trying to prove him wrong. What a wonderful motivator. And he's issuing a challenge. So it sort of seems to me that, you know, women are praised in the sporting world insofar as we don't get upset, insofar as we don't complain. And insofar as we don't ask for anything to change. And one of the ways in which women are praised is by bestowing this "she's like a machine" label upon them. I sort of just, as a kind of brief aside, want to say that, you know, I think there's a really gender difference in the way that men's complaints about sport and sporting kind of inequalities or unfairnesses are treated compared to women. And an example was really clear quite recently during debates about trans inclusion in parkrun. So whatever you think about trans inclusion in parkrun, this is really not about that debate, but it's about kind of the responses to women who are complaining versus men who are complaining. So there was an issue really about the fact that trans women were being, and you know still are, allowed to compete in parkrun under the female category, and that a number of course records, of particular parkrun courses, a number of female course records are held by trans women athletes. Now, some feminist campaigners were complaining about this, and we're told that parkrun's not a race, stop whinging. A particular thing on sort of American trail running groups in particular tends to be, well, you're just not training hard enough. If you're complaining about systemic inequalities, it's just a veil for like your own laziness, basically. So like women were kind of, in many ways, sort of shouted down. And Parkrun decided, for sort of years, sat on this and did nothing and sort of ignored women who were complaining. And then more recently, as the debate kind of got more airtime, Parkrun decided what they do is just delete all course records, delete all data. Parkrun is now, a participation event where there is no timing, there's no competitiveness. And suddenly lots of men got really upset and said, well, what about all my data? What about my course records? And actually the way that, those men are treated on kind of social media conversations, they're not being told they're whinging, they're not being shouted down, they're not told they're being transphobic, and so I think the way that, these complaints are being treated shows this kind of really gendered distinction in how complaining athletes are treated. I also think that this idea that women are praised in sport insofar as they don't disrupt the status quo goes hand in hand with women being praised for not disrupting stereotypical ideas of feminine beauty. And it seems really telling to me that that praise of Jasmine Paris for being a machine is coupled with the fact that she doesn't get upset, but also coupled with this praise of her swan-like appearance. And that sort of idea of a sort of swan-like beauty, I think, sort of suggests a form of facial appearance that doesn't betray any difficult emotions, that she's beautiful because she's emotionless. To finish, really, I want to go back to this picture of Jasmine Paris, because I think it's wonderful, really. But it also really shows, I think, how when sports journalists insist on portraying women, and portraying women like Jasmine Paris as serene and uncomplaining and undemanding and unfeeling machines who quietly acquiesce to male ideals in sport. They're doing this even though it's clearly not true. It seems to me this image couldn't make it any clearer how, some of the emotions that are kind of contained in Jasmine Paris's face, this immense pain and exhaustion, the kind of intensity, the fact that she's, a second off that sort of feeling of relief and joy and pride knowing that she's finished. This is not remotely the image that you would come up with, right? If you were trying to think of someone who never gets upset and is swan-like. So I sort of think, this phrase is being repeated and repeated, even though it's clearly not true. And it's also, this idea that she's like a machine because she never gets upset. It's kind of riding roughshod, really, over some of the really important things that she talks about in interviews that, if you actually listen to them, are about sort of anger and inequality and about, the work that she had to put in to be the first female finisher of the Barclays, the sort of toughness that she has, the constraints that she's had to negotiate, fitting her training around childcare, breastfeeding, expressing milk through the spine. She's sort of, she talks about, the importance of this win for female athletes and would-be athletes worldwide, and she's particularly passionate about challenging the drop-off in teenage girls' participation in sport. So I think to kind of say, she's this swan-like machine who never gets upset is kind of to try and neuter the political force of some of her comments. And, a journalist praised her for being quiet and modest. But again, this is just not an image that, to me, that's not what I take from it. That's not kind of why it's important, I think. To conclude, I just want to sort of think about different ways of achieving sort of female inclusion in sport, and what might we say instead of describing a woman as a swan-like machine. I'm currently working on a project at the moment with the Women in Sport charity, and I'm working through their archives. And in one of the early documents, sort of around the first 5 years of the charity being set up in the kind of, the charity was set up in 1984, there's a notes from a lecture that was given by one of Women in Sport's founders, Celia Brackenridge, where she talks about the different types of inclusion of women in sport. And she draws a really clear distinction between inclusion and transformation. So she says how she draws a kind of pathway for feminist activism in sport, where kind of inclusion is really just the first step, because inclusion implies women being allowed under sufferance into a sort of unchanged, male-dominated sporting world. But it's, it's only the first stage, and for her, the final stage, that sort of desired end of feminist activism in sport, is transformation. And she describes that as a state in which women have opportunities both to challenge and to change sport in ways that makes it more humane. And I really like that, descriptor of sport becoming more humane, because I think that seems to me to be the polar opposite of sports people being machine-like. Thank you.